So what we're looking at today is the Trail of Blood presentation number 9. We're moving right along here, actually. We have considered the time frame from 100 clear up through 599. And we've looked at 3 churches of the 7 churches of Asia that have fallen in this particular time frame. So what I want to do today is, in this presentation, we're going to move into Dr. Carroll's lecture concerning the time period from 600 through the 1300s. And there's only one of the 7 churches of Asia that actually fall within this time frame, and that's the church at Thyatira. But I want to consider Dr. Carroll's text first, and then we'll take a look at the church at Thyatira. And then we may have some additional things we'll throw in there before we leave this time frame. All right, so we're in the second lecture of Dr. Carroll's, 600 through 1300, and we go to his text. We close the first lecture with a close of the 5th century. And yet a number of things had their beginnings back in those early centuries, which are not even mentioned in the first lecture. We've just entered the awful period known as, in world's history, as the Dark Ages. And dark and bloody and awful in the extreme they were. World history has a lot to say about the Dark Ages as well. Not only were they Dark Ages in regards to spirituality, but they were dark in just about every other aspect as well. People don't seem to realize that when you have a doing away of godly, spiritual things, everything else is going to follow suit. But the world hasn't realized that yet. And all of this time, the world still has not recognized the fact that godly things bring about peace and harmony and prosperity. The persecutions by the established Roman Catholic Church are hard, cruel, and perpetual. The war of intended extermination follows persistently and relentlessly into many lands the fleeing Christians. The trail of blood is very nearly all that is left anywhere, especially through England, Wales, Africa, Armenia, and Bulgaria. And anywhere else Christians could be found who were trying earnestly to remain strictly loyal to New Testament teaching. We now call attention to those councils called ecumenical or empire-wide. It's well to remember that all of these councils were professedly based upon or patterned after the council held by the apostles and others at Jerusalem. You can see this happened in Acts chapter 15 and verse 1, but several passages of the book of Acts talk about this. But probably nothing bearing the same name could ever been more unlikely. You know, they said that these councils were based upon those of Acts, but reality is far different from what was said. We here and now call attention to only 8, and these were all called by different emperors, none of them by the popes. And all of these held among the Eastern or the Greek churches, what we now know as the Eastern Orthodox. Attended, however, somewhat by representatives from the Western branch or Roman Catholic or the Roman churches. By the way, Acts chapter 15 verse 1, and certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. They were adding works to salvation. And of course, that's been the case ever since. The first of these councils was held at Nice or Nicaea in AD 325. It was called by Constantine the Great and was attempted by 318 bishops. The second met at Constantinople in AD 381 and was called by Theodosius the Great. there were present 150 bishops. Now, in the early centuries, bishops simply meant pastors of the individual churches. And that's exactly what the Bible has reference to when it talks about a bishop. The third was called by Theodosius and by Valesian the third, and this had 250 bishops present. And it met at Ephesus in AD 431. The fourth met at Chalcedon in AD 451 and was called by Emperor Marian. 500 or 600 bishops or metropolitans. Metropolitans were city pastors or first church pastors, and there were 500 to 600 of them present. During this council, the doctrine of what is now known as mariolatry was promulgated. This means the worship of Mary, the mother of Christ. This new doctrine at first created quite a stir, many seriously objecting, but it finally won out as a permanent doctrine of the Catholic Church. The fifth of these 8 councils was held at Constantinople, which was the second to be held there. This was called by Justinian, AD 553, and was attended by 165 bishops. This seemingly was called to condemn certain writings. In AD 680, the 6th council was called. This also was held at Constantinople and was called by Constantine Pagnator to condemn heresy. During this meeting, Pope Honorius by name was deposed and excommunicated. Now, I wondered what this pope had done that would so enrage the members of this council to kick this pope out, especially when they had already strayed so far from the truth. According to a website maintained by the Vatican, www.vatican.com, this is basically what happened, and I quote from this website. Pope Honorius I is remembered in Catholic history for having administered numerous initiatives. He was involved in the controversy between the monophysites and orthodoxy. He argued that Christ did not possess a divine and a human will at the same time, but that he had only a single will which was expressed through his human and divine natures. This argument was commonly known as monothelitism. However, his belief in monothelitism proved challenging for the popes and councils that followed thereafter, because no one was ready to admit that a pope could believe in such a sacrilege argument, as monothelitism was later condemned as a heretical doctrine by the Third Council of Constantinople in 680. In 680 and 681, Pope Honorius I was retrospectively convicted as a heretic and was excommunicated from the church by the Ecumenical Council of Third Constantinople, unquote. Now that was history according to the Vatican. However, at this time, infallibility had not yet been declared. Now, if that had been in place, then that would have become another false doctrine of the Catholic Church. But the Pope wasn't infallible yet. I mean, he could still make mistakes. The Seventh Council was called to meet at Nicaea in AD 787, and this was the second held at this place. The Empress Irene called this one. Here in this meeting seems to have been the definite starting place of both image worship and saints worship. So you can see thus that these people are getting more and more markedly paganized than Christianized. Now, I've never heard of Empress Irene, so I went back and I did a little bit of search on this gal. Now, I don't have this up here. Empress Irene, being the first woman to rule the empire, which she did after having her own son blinded to make him unfit to rule. Irene is also known for her support of icons in the Eastern Orthodox Church, for which she was made a saint. And that's from History, Medrin, about Irene of Athens. That was interesting, to say the least. She probably didn't know that at the time, but she was the one that really brought about the saint worship, yes. The last of what were called the Eastern Councils, those called by the emperors, was held in Constantinople in AD 869. This was called by Basilius Merato. The Catholic Church had gotten into serious trouble. There had arisen a controversy of a very serious nature between the heads of the two branches of Catholicism, East and Western, Greek and Roman, Pontius the Greek at Constantinople and Nicholas I at Rome. So serious was their trouble, and I had to laugh at this, that they had gone so far as to excommunicate each other. I thought, what a thought. So for a short time, Catholicism was entirely without a head. The council was called mainly to settle, if possible, this difficulty. This break in the ranks of Catholicism has never, even to this day in the 21st century, been satisfactorily settled. Since that faraway day, all attempts at healing that breach have failed. Even modern attempts have failed. The Lateran power since then has been in the ascendancy. Not the emperors, but the Roman pontiffs calling all councils. The later councils were referred to later in these lectures, so some of those are still coming up. There is one new doctrine to which we have failed to call attention. There are doubtless others, but this one's especially, and that is infant communion. Infants were not only baptized, but received into the church, and being church members, they were supposed to be entitled to the Lord's Supper. When you think about that flawed logic, you can see the logic of it. And you're going to find, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but when you develop one false doctrine, many others have to come after it in order to justify that one. It's like when you tell one lie, you have to tell another lie to cover it up, and so on and so forth, until the truth is so far removed you take a telescope to find it, or you can't find it. How to administer it to them was a problem, but it was solved by soaking the bread in the wine. I wonder how many of these babies grew up to be alcoholics, huh? Thus it was practiced for years. After a while, another new doctrine was added to this. It was taught that this was another means of salvation. As still another new doctrine was added to these, we'll again refer to and a little later in the lectures. During the 5th century, at the 4th Ecumenical Council held at Chalcedon in 451, another entirely new doctrine was added to the rapidly growing list. The doctrine is called mariolatry, the worship of Mary, the mother of Jesus. A new mediator seems to have been felt to be needed. Now, you're going to find that now, not only is she worshipped, now she is taking the place of Jesus as the mediator. The distance from God to man was too great for just one mediator, even though that was Christ, God's Son, the real God-man. Mary was thought to be needed as another mediator, and so prayers were made to Mary, and she was to make them to Christ. Two new other doctrines were added to the Catholic Church in the 8th century. These were promulgated at the Second Council held at Nicaea or Nice. That's Italy, by the way. The Second Council held there in 787. The first of these was called image worship, a direct violation of one of the commands of God. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, according to Exodus chapter 20, verses 3, 4, and 5. Although that was part of the Mosaic law, God still did not want any other gods before him. The principles of the Mosaic law have always been in effect, including that one. So another addition from paganism. Then followed the worship of saints. This doctrine has no encouragement in the Bible. Only one instant of saint worship is given in the Bible, and that is given to show its utter folly. The dead rich man praying to Abraham in Luke 16, verses 24 through 31. These were some, but not all, of the revolutionary changes from New Testament teachings that came about during this period of church history. So we see, and they are getting farther and farther and farther away from the truth. During the period that we're now passing through, the persecuted were called by many and varied names. Among them were Donatists, Patarines, Cathari, Paulicians, and Anabaptists, and a little later, Petrobrusians, Arnoldists, Henrietians, Albigenses, and Waldenses. I want to expand a little bit in our study on these particular groups. Sometimes one group of these was the most prominent and sometimes another. But some of them almost always prominent because of the persistency and the terribleness of their persecution. Let it not be thought that all of these persecuted ones were always loyal in all respects to New Testament teachings. In the main, they were. And some of them, considering their surroundings, were marvelously so. Remember that many of them at that far away time had only parts of the New Testament or the Old Testament as to that. The book was not printed. It was written in manuscript on parchment of skin or skins or something of that kind, and was necessarily large and bulky. The fact that so many of these remained faithful to what they had of the New Testament or even the Old Testament is remarkable. They did not have the complete Bible. My remarks. Few, if any, families or even simple churches had complete copies of the whole Bible. And I can think we see why it's so remarkable that they were so faithful to what they knew. They didn't have all the New Testament. So there was so much that they did not know, so they couldn't be faithful to. But I submit, looking back from this viewpoint, to the faithfulness that they had to what they did know, if they had had the entire truth of the written truth of the New Testament, they would have been faithful to the rest of it as well. Before the formal close of the canon, which was at the end of the 4th century, there were probably very few simple manuscripts of the entire New Testament. Of the 1,000 known manuscripts, only about 30 copies included all of the books. Now, folks, that is not much of the Bible. Furthermore, during all the period of the Dark Ages and the period of persecution, strenuous efforts were made to destroy even what Scripture manuscripts the persecuted did possess. Hence, in many instances, these people had only small parts of the Bible. It's well to note that also that in order to prevent the spread of any view of any sort contrary to those of the Catholics, very extreme plans and measures were adopted. First, all the writings of any sort other than those of the Catholics were gathered and burned. Especially was this true of books. For several centuries, these plans and measures were strictly and persistently followed. That is, according to history, the main reason why it is so difficult to secure accurate history. About all persistent writers and preachers also died martyr deaths. As we continue in this, you'll note that not all of those that were martyred were preachers. Many of them were writers and lay people. But they were persecuted and they were killed because they were trying to refute the doctrines of the Catholic Church. This was a desperately bloody period. All of the groups of persistent heretics, so-called, and I'm glad Dr. Carroll put that in there. I didn't put that in there. By whatever name distinguished, and wherever they had lived, were cruelly persecuted. The Dontonists and the Paulicians were among the earlier groups. The Catholics, strange as it may seem, accused all who refused to depart from the faith with them, believe with them, accused them of being heretics, and then condemned them as being heretics. So it is important when we study church history to know that 99 times out of 100, whenever a group of people were called heretics, you could almost be certain that they were really the people that at least were standing for what truth that they knew. Those called Catholics became more thoroughly paganized and Judaized than they were Christianized, and were swayed by far more by civil power than they were by religious power. They made far more new laws than they observed old ones. The following are a few of the many new variations that came about in New Testament teachings during those centuries. They're probably not always given in the order of their promulgation. In fact, it would sometimes be next to impossible to get the exact date of the origin from some of these changes. And some of them didn't come about just immediately like that. It was a process of a change. In other words, it wasn't overnight. They have been somewhat like the whole Catholic system. They are growths of development. In the earlier years especially, their doctrines or teachings were subject to constant change by addition or subtraction or substitution or by abrogation. The Catholic Church was no longer, even if it ever had been, a real New Testament church. It no longer was a purely executive body to carry out the already made laws of God, but had become actively legislative, making new ones, changing or abrogating old ones at will. Abrogating means doing away with. One of their new doctrines or declarations about this time was, quote, there is no salvation outside the church, unquote. The Catholic Church, of course, as they declared there was no other. In other words, you had to be a Catholic or be lost. There was no alternative. What a sad state of affairs this has become. Jesus is no longer the head of the church. The Holy Spirit is no longer the power of the church. Man has become its sole head and power. It's a good thing that Jesus gave the promise he did in Matthew 16:18. Because without this promise, it's quite possible that true and faithful churches would have vanished into history. Matthew 16:18 says, and this is Jesus speaking, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.